A lot of NHL teams really like to be good. They think they're super. They think they're powerful. They think they're above their own station and all that. Many teams feel that way, but in the end, they get nipped in the bud. Everyone thinks about the 62 win 1996 Detroit Red Wings. They looked pretty good, but they struggled against the Blues in the second round, and then Colorado got them right for the picking in 6 games. Not to mention having Patrick Waugh in the net works out. And then the 62 win 2019 Tampa Bay Lightning. They were good. They had tied that record. They looked good with Vasilevsky in the net. But all of a sudden, they ended up losing the first round to the Columbus Blue Jackets in 4 straight. Shocking. But it did help Tampa out because they did win back to back Stanley Cups. So basically, from pain becomes greatness. And of course, the 2023 Boston Bruins, in the fact that they won 65 games and couldn't get out of the first round against those pesky Florida Panthers, despite having a 3-1 series lead. So, with that in mind, let's talk about a team that didn't get out of the first round of the playoffs that's kind of underrated and how, they had such a great season, but yet they faltered in the playoffs. I'm talking about the 1991 Chicago Blackhawks in this video. Hello out there, we're on the air. It's Cutter with NHL time. Tensions blow, the whistle blown, and the pucks go down the ice. Some teams just want to win the cup and do it with a smile. Hey, that is cool. Up on the River Nile. Oh, the good old hockey game. Who will come out on top? Will a team get through the cup by any means necessary? Oh, the good old hockey game. It's the best game you can name. And I'm have no shame. I will simulate those hockey games. Woo! All right, so the 1991 Chicago Blackhawks will be talked about, but let's talk about the Chicago franchise as a whole. So the Blackhawks came into the NHL in 1926 alongside Detroit, bringing American expansion to the NHL. Chicago actually ended up picking up players from the Portland Western Hockey League roster. Back in the old days, the PCHA, the Pacific Coast League, and the Western Hockey League, not the major junior league we have now in Canada, were major competitors to the NHL and would send their champions in to try to dethrone the NHL champions to win the Stanley Cup. It only happened once in the whole NHL versus PCHL/WHA, which was the Victoria team in 1925. Nevertheless, the Patricks were good, but then they went into the NHL for business and the two leagues folded. Not the NHL, but the two Western leagues folded. Chicago found players off of the Portland roster and decided to put them in as Blackhawks. Chicago struggled through the first decade. They actually had to play home games in Windsor for a little bit and at the Chicago Coliseum before Chicago Stadium was built. It's kind of weird how you call it Chicago Stadium, but it's a stadium, but it's indoors. Nevertheless, the Blackhawks in 1934 shocked everyone by winning the Stanley Cup. And and the goalie Charlie Gardner was huge. Unfortunately for Gardner, he avoided tonsillitis and he avoided getting a procedure done, and that led to his body being hit hard and ravaged. And 2 months after he won the Stanley Cup as a member of the Blackhawks, he passed away. The Blackhawks in 1938 also won the Stanley Cup, but this team was 12 games below 500 or something like that. But thanks to the playoff format at the time, they actually pulled off a couple of upsets before facing the Leafs in the Stanley Cup Finals. Chicago didn't have their star goalie Mike Caracas. He broke his toe, so they had to find this guy named Alfie Moore in net. They drove him from a tavern because Chicago didn't have any other goalies, and he beat the Leafs. It was said that the Leafs were so sour they decided to make sure Alfie Moore did not play in the Stanley Cup playoffs. There was some other guy that the Blackhawks used. They lost game two, but then Caracas, using a skate with a protective toe cover, played the rest of the Stanley Cup final, and the Blackhawks won the Stanley Cup from the Leafs. The Blackhawks would start to struggle in all that in the 40s and 50s. So much so that when the NHL Players Association was trying to build, like Ted Lindsay wanted a players' union, every team's massive representative got the boot, pretty much to Chicago. Ted Lindsay went to Chicago alongside Glenn Hall. Jeremy Thompson from the Leafs went to the Blackhawks, and a few other players went to Chicago. It was basically hockey Siberia for trying to form a union. But remember, this is the 1950s when things are a lot different than they are now. So the fact of the matter is that the Blackhawks were getting these players. And it also helped that they had a farm system in St. Catharines, Ontario, for the St. Catharines Blackhawks, which brought two of the greatest Chicago Blackhawks of all time, Bobby Hull and Stan Mikita. So the Blackhawks were building great. In 1961, they dethroned the five-time Stanley Cup champion Montreal Canadiens in the semifinals. In fact, a Montreal fan, oh, sorry, that was 1962 when not Montreal. In fact, when they won the Stanley Cup in 1961, in 1962, when the Habs placed the Blackhawks in the playoffs, a Montreal fan by the name of Ken Killander stole the Stanley Cup and tried to bring it back to Montreal where it belongs. Weird. But anyhow, yeah, the Blackhawks won that cup in 1961. Few would believe that it would take half a century before the Blackhawks would ever get another cup. The Hawks tried. They had a few good teams. In 1967, they should have crushed those pesky Toronto Maple Leafs in the semifinals. They were the best team in the league. But unfortunately, the Leafs used Sawchuk and Bauer to full effect, and the Leafs won the series and the cup. Chicago kept getting closer and closer. In 1971, they got to the final and faced the Montreal Canadiens. They gave Montreal a tough time. And in Game 7 on home ice, you think Chicago would definitely have it. Wrong. They were up 2-0, and then Henri Richard blasted a shot from center ice that eluded Tony Esposito in the net. Former Hab, by the way. And it was 2-1. And then a few other goals. One by Henri Richard made it 3-2, and Montreal won the Stanley Cup with a rookie Ken Dryden in the net. The Hawks 2 years later would face the Habs again in the Stanley Cup Finals and lose in 6 games. Chicago kept trying and trying. Tony Esposito was getting older, but he was getting effective and all that. Bobby Hull left the Blackhawks for the WHA, or the World Hockey Association. Mikita was there till the end of 1980. Chicago kept trying desperately to get to the finals at the very least. So in 1992, the Blackhawks did make the finals on the basis of an 11-game winning streak within the playoffs. They won their last 3 games against the Blues in the first round. They swept the Detroit Red Wings in the division final, and they swept the Edmonton Oilers in the conference finals. But they ended up getting swept by Pittsburgh themselves. In 93, Chicago looked pretty good to make a run for the cup, but unfortunately, Ed Belfour did not do so well, and the Blues swept the Blackhawks in the first round. They scored an overtime on a goal that should not have been allowed because Belfour got bumped. The Blackhawks would have a rivalry with the Leafs in the playoffs for a while. The Hawks had some lean years, especially in the late 90s, early 2000s, when TV coverage was not there because Bill Wirtz was one of the worst owners around. And Chicago suffered. But through shrewd drafting of like Jonathan Toews and Patrick Kane, the Hawks were getting back in the thick of things. And in 2010, they got to the finals against the Philadelphia Flyers. People were wondering if Chicago would break that 50-year drought. And they did. Patrick Kane scored the winning goal in Game 6 of overtime in Philadelphia, and the streak was over. The slump was over. The Blackhawks won in 2013 and 2015. They have done decently. Connor Bedard has been trying his best to make things happen. So anyway, let's talk about the 1991 Hawks. All right, so the 1991 Chicago Blackhawks. This was the team's 65th season. The Blackhawks were close the past 2 years to making the Stanley Cup Finals. They lost to Calgary in '89 and Edmonton in 1990. They were thinking this was their year. The Blackhawks would be the host of the NHL All-Star Game. And of course, that All-Star Game was the one in which Wayne Messmer did that big rendition of Star Spangled Banner. And it was one of the loudest arena sounds in the NHL in history. They won the President's Trophy for best record in the league and had some great performances. Steve Larmer came through, Jerry Moronic, Chris Chelios, Dirk Graham, and Ed Belfour as a rookie. Everyone thought the Blackhawks were looking pretty good. Mike Keaton would become general manager. He was still coach, but made he was made to be the GM. Some older Blackhawks retired, but then Keaton made a shocking trade to Montreal, trading Denny Savard, who was plunked third overall in the 1980 draft. And of course, this was when Montreal had the number one pick and took Doug Wickenheiser instead. So they traded Denny. So Denny Savard went to Chicago for 10 years. He was good. And then they traded him to Montreal for Chris Chelios. Because Keaton thought he needed a good defenseman, and Chelios was the right answer. And Chelios was getting too big for his britches in Montreal. In the 1990 draft, they drafted Carl Dykhouse in the first round. Steve Dubinsky went 11th overall, 11th round. Blackhawks were looking pretty good, full of themselves. They won 106 points. They actually beat St. Louis by an inch. St. Louis won 105 points. The NHL had, well, the Blackhawks had the best defense and all that, and most penalized team. So anyway, the 42nd NHL All-Star Game was legendary for taking place in Chicago. The Campbell Conference, aka the West, taking on the West Conference, now called the East. It was huge and all of that. Of course, opposite Operation Desert Storm and all of that. And some players said that the game should be delayed because of the war with Iraq. Nevertheless, Wayne Messmer stepped to the microphone to play the national anthem. It was a patriotic moment that transcended the sport. So the Hawks won 106 points. Blues were second. Detroit third. Minnesota fourth. Of course, this was when the top four teams in each division would make the playoffs. By conference, Chicago, if it was 1 versus 8, it would have been Chicago versus Vancouver in the playoffs. And maybe they would have had a better chance. People thought that the Minnesota North Stars were the worst team in the NHL for points in the 91 playoffs. Of course, you know the North Stars and their famous playoff run, which started against the Blackhawks. But no, the Canucks only had 65 points. They looked pretty impressive. Steve Larmer looked well, and people were like happy. Ed Belfour playing 74 games, winning 43 of them. There was no clear cut backup. Hasek. People forget Dominic Hasek played for the Hawks and in 1991 as well. Anyway, the Hawks would face Minnesota in the first round. They took care of Minnesota in 7 games in 1990. Anyhow, it was a shocking moment. Well, Minnesota won in overtime in game one. I can't remember. I think it was Bobby Smith who scored. And then the Hawks won 2 straight games to go 2-1. However, the North Stars went to Chicago for game 5 after winning game 4 on home turf and shut out the Hawks 6-0. And the Hawks were upset, rightfully so. Minnesota would take care of business and actually shocked St. Louis and Edmonton to make the Stanley Cup Finals against Pittsburgh and have a 2-1 series lead on the Penguins before they fell. So anyway, Ed Belfour just wasn't himself, which was kind of weird. Hasek the backup and all that. Yeah, they won the President's Trophy for most points. The Calder Memorial Trophy went to Ed Belfour. He was a rookie. He actually played 20 plus games in the NHL, but the rule was 25 games. So Belfour still was technically a rookie, and with their 43 wins. Derek Graham wins the Selke for defensive forward, Belfour best goalie, and the best goalie with the best goals against. He was named goalie on the NHL rookie team. Chris Chelios, Jeremy Roenick, and Steve Larmer were all second team All Stars. So yeah, so the Blackhawks choked it, but they came back in '92 to the finals finally. The '91 Hawks. What would happen if they took care of business with the Minnesota North Stars? And the fact of the '91 Hawks, I just want to add this in before we go to the simulation, is they screwed up. They were the most penalized team, but they kept getting penalties, and the North Stars used the power play to their full advantage, crushing the Hawks in that department. So, anyway, the Blues and Hawks would have met in the second round because the Blues took care of the Red Wings, although they were down 3 games to 1. So Vincent Riendeau would be the starting goalie against Ed Belfour. See here all the main guys and all that. So anyway, that's what happens. Oh yeah, we gotta make sure to play off our home team. And the first game goes to the Hawks 5-3. Larmer and Goulet scored in the first period, but the Blues scored 3 goals in the second. Dan Quinn, Sergio Momesso, and Cliff Ronnie. Of course, this is kind of biased because they have all the players for the 91 Blues on this thing. And I do know damn well that Dan Quinn and Cliff Ronnie both were Canucks for the 91 playoffs. Anyway, Sergio Momesso scoring. I think he also went. Did Momesso go to Vancouver in that trade? I think they did. Dave Manson made it. So it's 3-3. Dirk Graham scores, and then he scores again, and they decide to take Riendeau out for Pat Jablonski. Dave Manson got a double minor, but the Blues couldn't capitalize. Good job by Jablonski coming in for Riendeau. Graham, Goulet, and Larmer, your 3 stars. Game 2 would see the Hawks crush the Blues 8-4, and probably that's the end of Riendeau. Anyway, the Blues were up 2-0. Paul McLean, yes, that Paul McLean, and Brett Hall made it 2-0. Jerry R with 2 goals. Glenn Featherstone got ejected by the Blues for a knee call. Garth Butcher would have to start the penalty. Now that's actually accurate because Garth Butcher was a Canuck, but he got traded to St. Louis in that deal. Larmer scored, Dirk Graham scored, then Brett Hall made it 4-3, but Adam Crichton made it 5-3. Jablonski comes in the net. It didn't work out as Dirk Graham would put up 3 goals in the third period, scoring a kind of a natural hat trick, if you will. And Adam Oates made it 8-4, so the Hawks were looking pretty good. Keith Brown got injured thanks to Glenn Featherstone. Dirk Graham, Adam Oates, and Brett Hall with 3 stars. It's weird how the Blues had 2 stars of the game and they got their asses whipped. So Keith Brown would be out for Chris Chelios. I don't know why I don't have Chris Chelios as the main defenseman. Cujo will play game 3 because, after all, they had a second goalie option. And the plan fails as the Hawks went 8-5. Brett Hall made it 1-0. Peluso, of all people, made it 1-1. Glenn Featherstone made it 2-1. Larmer 2-2, and then Brett Hall 3-2. Manson 3-3. So it was a goals fest. Michel Goulet and Jeremy Roenick both scored, and then Joseph was replaced by Pat Jablonski. Adam Oates made it 5-4. Steve Tuttle, the guy who, has gate blade cut into Mount Larchuk a couple years earlier, made it 5-5. JR scored, and Larmer made it 7-5. Steve Thomas made it 8-5, game over. Jablonski really wasn't that bad. Paul McLean got hurt. Roenick, Larmer, and Goulet were given the 3 stars. So the Hawks look like they're going to win. But that's Jablonski, and you say, that's 3-0. And that's 4. And that's 4. Chicago wins 6-4. Big win for them. Dirk Graham scored. Jeff Corno scored. That kind of doesn't work. Chris Chelios somehow got a headbutting call and got ejected. Brett Hall made it 2-1. On a 2-man power play, because Chelios' 5-minute penalty happened, they could score as often as they could. And of course, Duke Grimson got penalized. Brett Hall made it 3-1 Blues. Doug Wilson and Dave Manson made it 3-3. Roenick made it 4-3. And in the third period, Courtnall tied it. But Gilbert scored. Make it 5-4. And then JR with the dagger. Roenick, Courtnall, and Hall are your 3 stars of the game. So the Hawks would have hosted the playoffs. We don't touch the other division, so it was the Edmonton Oilers who came out of their division. And Bill Ranford will be in the net to start. Klima, Steve Smith. Yeah, he did play. That's right. Steve Smith did play for the Oilers that year. Then went to Chicago the next year because the fans were so fucking relentless. The Hawks win game 1. Thomas, Larmer, and Larmer scoring the goals. Larmer. Tikkanen made it 3-1. Craig Simpson made it 3-2. And then Mike Peluso scoring an empty net goal 4-2. Chelios, Ranford, and Larmer get 3 stars. Ranford for all those shots he had to face. Game 2. Sees the Hawks lose 3-2 as the Oilers come back. Third Graham and Troy Murray scoring for the Hawks. Peter Klima for the Oilers. And then Messier scored, and then there was a fight between Klima and Chelios. That actually worked out for both teams. Edmonton lost a good scorer, and Chicago lost Chelios on defense. Mark Messier would make it 3-2, and the Oilers would win Game 1. Ranford, their first star for saving 2 out of 53 shots. Messier and Klima, your 3 stars. So it's 1-1, headed to Edmonton, and we have overtime. Chicago won. Goulet made it 1-0. Bookaboo made it 1-1. People forget he was an Oiler. Messier made it 2-1. Roenick 2-2. Joe Murphy 3-2 for the Oilers. Soon he would be a Hawk. Steve Larmer made it 3-3. Michel Goulet made it 4-3. Jelinas tied it at 4 when he was an Oiler. Samanoff made it 5-4. Steve Larmer made it 5-5. Steve Larmer gets a hat trick in overtime to win the game 6-5. Larmer, Goulet, and Roenick are your 3 stars. Game 4 sees the Oilers come back to win in overtime. Mike Peluso got ejected early in the game. Chris Joseph made it 1-0 for the Oilers. Roenick on the power play made it 1-1. Tony McKagney, remember him? 2-1. Roenick made it 3-1. Chicago looked like they were going to win for sure. Well, Glenn Anderson made it 3-2 and then tied in the third period. Chicago got penalized, but it didn't work out. Joe Murphy scored on a rebound, and the Oilers win the game 4-3 to force a game 6 at the very least. Anderson, Roenick, and Ranford, your 3 stars. Back to Chicago. And it would be the Oilers winning game 5 in overtime 4-3. Unbelievable. Larmer made it 1-0 Hawks. Simpson 1-1. Dirk Graham 2-1. Huddy made it 2-2. Michel Goulet made it 3-2. Dave Manson gets ejected for spearing, so Paul Gillis has to return that call. Keith Brown gets called for cross-checking. Bob McGill gets angry and gets caught for unsportsmanlike. Charlie Huddy made a 2-man power play to make it 3-3. Creighton and Huddy would be in the box for 5 minutes. And in overtime, Joe Murphy at 125, again scoring in overtime. Huddy, Simpson, and Goulet are your 3 stars. Will the Oilers win the Stanley Cup? The answer is no. Well, not yet. As Chicago wins 6-2 to force Game 7 back home. Hawks goes by Murray, Roenick, and Roenick. Glenn Anderson made 3. Esatikinen made it 3-2. Goulet and Creighton made it 5-2 and chased Ranford as Fuhrer comes in the net. Doug Wilson made it 6-2. The question in my mind is, do you put Fuhrer in Game 7 or no? No, because Ranford has played the lion's share. Roenick, Creighton, and Belfort, your 3 stars. Will Chicago win the Stanley Cup? Answer is they could, and they might. Could be. The Blackhawks win Game 7 5-3 on home turf and send the Oilers home. Craig Simpson with pair goals for Edmonton. Mike Peluso gets ejected again. Messier and Troy Murray fight. And then Blackhawks on a shorthanded call. Creighton made it 2-1. Michel Goulet tied it at 2. Dave Manson made it 3-2. Murphy again 3-3. Chelios on the power play thanks to Gillian in the box. Makes it 4-3. And then Roenick scores a power play goal to make it 5-3. Game set match. Ranford tries, he just couldn't do it. Goulet, Simpson, Ranford did face 59 shots. He did quite well. I don't think Van Fuhrer would have done much. So the Pittsburgh Penguins would have faced the Chicago Blackhawks. So Tom Barrasso, Lemieux, Stevens, Recchi, Paul Coffey, and Alf Samuelson. You're telling me those 2 guys can't be the starters? So anyway, we go to Game 1 in Chicago because Chicago had more points than those Penguins. So Lemieux versus Belfort. Game 1 sees the Hawks win, although it was close, 6-5. Penguins goals by Johnny Cullen and Kevin Stevens, although Cullen's goal should be mute. unit, like null and void, because Cullen was traded to Hartford in the Ron Francis deal. Dirk Graham scores for the Hawks. Phil Bork made it 3-1 Penguins, but Michel Goulet and Greg Gilbert both scoring power play goals on the same one as Bobby Urey got a double minor. Michel Goulet made it 4-3 Hawks. Yager made it 4-4. Keith Brown and Steve Thomas made it 6-4. Lemieux scored on the power play, but too little too late. Goulet, Coffey, Kitchener, and JR, your 3 stars. Game 2 sees the Penguins win 6-3 that forced at least a game 5. Armour scored for Chicago, but then 4 straight goals by Gordy Roberts, John Cullen, and Phil Bork made it 4-1. Steve Larmer made it 4-2. Kevin Stevens scored, and then Belfort was taken out by Keenan. Larmer scores a hat trick to make it 5-3. Sarli Salapsky scored. That definitely is amazing. Said, well, you got traded to Pittsburgh. To Hartford. Steve Thomas and Gordy Roberts were, lots of brouhaha. Steve Thomas, Gordy Roberts, Adam Crane, and John Cullen were all penalized. 20 penalties. 4-20 Blackbirds. Stu Grimms and Justin Lemieux. Barrasso, Larmer, and Cullen are your stars of the game. And Lemieux got hurt. Nothing to worry about. Game 2 sees the Penguins lose 5-2 as all Samson did score for Pittsburgh. Goulet, Roenick, and Murray scored. Troy Murray got a double minor for boarding. There was a massive fight. Paul Gillis got a few minutes for instigating a fight. Stu Grimson had to serve it, and Gillis got a 10-minute misconduct. Kevin Stevens got a 5-minute penalty for fighting. So it was 3-1. Roenick made it 4-1. Bobby Urey 4-2, and then Steve Larmer made it 5-2. Only 9 penalties, but the penalty minutes were like amazing. Goulet, Belfort, and Roenick are your 3 stars. 1-1. Game 3 sees the Penguins lose 7-5 as Francis, Cullen, and Recchi made it 3-0 Penguins. Larmer made it 3-1. John Cullen made it 4-1, so it looks good for Pittsburgh. Creighton made it 4-2. But Roenick, Goulet, Chelios, and Goulet scoring 4 goals in the second period. Brassos replaced Peter Angelo. Paul Stanton made it 6-5 Penguins, trailing. Dave Manson made it 7-5. Tangalani got a double minor. Peter Angelo did well in the net after Brasso gave up those 6 goals. Chelios, Goulet, Cullen, the stars. My question is, do you put Peter Angelo in game 4? You don't. And Barrasso hears the whispers. It's like, put him in the net. Put Peter Angelo in the net. Pittsburgh wins 4-3. As Francis and Mullen scored in the second period for Pittsburgh, Chicago, Roenick, Murray. Troy Murray made it 3-2 Hawks. Gordy Roberts with a pair of goals. Gordy Roberts, 4-3. Roberts, Barrasso, and Troy Murray are your 3 stars. Troy Murray. So it's 2-2, hit it back home. Back home. And back home, the Hawks win 8-6. Penguins did take a 3-1 lead. Well, Cullen, Lemieux, and Recchi scoring for Pittsburgh. Dave Manson makes it a goal for Chicago. Doug Wilson, Dirk Graham tied it at 3. Manson makes it 4-3. John Cullen for the Penguins. Adam Creighton gets it 5-4. Peluso again gets ejected. What an idiot. The Blackhawks, even though they lost Paul Gillis and Chris Chelios in the box, they do score a shorthander by Trent Yanni. Penguins can't take advantage. Goulet makes it 7-4. Francis 7-5. Stevens 7-6. So it looks like the Penguins are going to make a massive comeback. Nope. Larmer scores the empty netter. Well, Peter Angelo came in for the last 16 minutes. Larmer, Manson, and K. Stevens are your 3 stars. Now the question is, will the Hawks finish it off in Pittsburgh? The answer is no. We got ourselves a game 7. Amazing. Dirk Graham scoring 2 goals for Chicago in the first period. Paul Coffey, Kitchener, and Mark Recchi made it 2-2. Sarlislavsky made it 3-2. Phil Bork 4-2. Mark Recchi 5-2. Belfort gets ejected for Hasek. Tagliani made 6-2. Goulet makes it 6-3. Jerry Roenick 6-4. Gilbert 6-5. And then Steve Thomas ties it at 6. The final minute with Coffey and McGill in the box. Troy Loney of all freaking people. Make it 7-6. Penguins win. Hasek tried his best. Recchi, Thomas, and Graham, your 3 stars. So we go to Game 7. Will the Blackhawks win the Stanley Cup, or will Mario Lemieux get his cup? The answer is the cup goes to Pittsburgh. The Chicago Blackhawks lose Game 7 in overtime. Steve Larmer and Bob Erie both score. A couple of coincidental calls. Adam Creighton scores to make it 2-1. And then there's a fight between Jake Caulfield and Chris Chelios. Unfortunately, Caulfield gets the instigator, and Grant Jennings is in the box. Bad news for the Penguins defensively is JR made a goal to make it 3-1. JR then made it 4-1. It looks like it's over. Sorry, the Slapsky made it 4-2. Slapsky and Stevens 4-4. And then there's a fight between Creighton and Erie, but Creighton gets in trouble for instigating, making Peluso serve the penalty. John Cullen scored a pair of goals to make it 6-4, and it looked good for the Penguins. JR, with 5 minutes left, makes it 6-5. And then Steve Thomas, with 68 seconds left, scores. And then Bob Erie, of all freaking people, from Solapsky and Cullen, to win the game for the Penguins. To win in overtime. And the Blackhawks go on this magical journey, only to lose Game 7 in overtime to Mario Lemieux. Cullen, Erie, and Roenick are your 3 stars. And I think that John Cullen deserves to be the Stanley Cup MVP. Lemieux was useless as much, but John Cullen stepped up to the plate, even though that he wasn't a Penguin at the end of the 91 season. But it doesn't matter. The Penguins take out the Blackhawks, and all is well in Pittsburgh. Not so in Chicago. Anyway, I'm Jeff Diamond. Adieu.